And this evening we're going to be talking about an interesting subject, stool transplantation, which I'm sure most of our viewers know very little about, because I don't know much about it, and I don't think many physicians do. So we welcome you back.
Well, thanks, Rick. Thanks, Jim.
Thanks. Dr. Phillips, again, would you just give us a little background of yourself?
Sure. It's an important to understand what a gastroenterologist is. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist, and what that means is I went to medical school. I went to college, Princeton University. I went through Princeton on an Army ROTC scholarship. After graduating from Princeton, I went to medical school at Washington University in St. Louis, and I spent 4 years there. And then after concluding medical school, I did my internal medicine training for 3 years at Jefferson Hospital in Philadelphia. And then I was selected to be chief resident there for a 4th year. And then after concluding my 4 years at Jefferson in Philadelphia, I went on active duty and was assigned to an Army post called Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. And I was an internist there. And then after 2 years, I was selected for gastroenterology training and did that training at Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. And after 2 years of training in gastroenterology, I was selected to be on staff, and I was on staff at Walter Reed for 2 more years. And in 1991, I concluded my obligation in the Army, and I went into private practice and came down to Naples, Florida, and I've been practicing here ever since. And we have an office in downtown Naples on Goodlet Road and Colonial Square, and over the years, our practice has expanded, and I'm now practicing with Dr. Susan Lebersky, Dr. Neil Randall, Michael Marks, Dr. Michael Marks, and our newest addition is Dr. Gustavo Rivera. And we have offices as well up in Bonita Springs and as well as in Marco Island. So we're trying to meet all the gastrointestinal needs of South Lee County and Collier County. And
I know you have mine.
Yeah. Appreciate that.
So, what do you want?
So tell us about, why would anybody want a stool transplant?
Well, this is really an exciting topic, and this represents a tremendous change in medicine. And you don't see many changes in medicine to this degree, but about every 25 years or so. And so you can almost go an entire career without seeing a whole paradigm shift. But first off, we're going to sort of recap some concepts we've talked about before. First, there's a concept of this bacterial population within our GI tract, within the colon in particular, that we would collectively refer to as the microbiome, a community of bacteria that you accumulate shortly after birth from your mother, from your father, and that bacterial population collectively referred to as called the microbiome. It remains fairly stable and steady throughout your lifetime. Now, what that microbiome does, that stable population of bacteria, it protects you. And I'm not talking about 1 or 2 bacteria. We're talking about 1,000 different species of bacteria and tremendous numbers, more than 100 times the number. The number of bacteria within your colon is about 100 times more than all the cells in your body. And so collectively, there's great diversity, great biodiversity within the microbiome. And what we've learned over the years, there's a number of beneficial functions it provides. It provides certain vitamins. It provides about 15% of your nutrition through fermentation of foods that have not been fully absorbed in the small intestine. And increasingly, we realize it has an antibacterial function as far as releasing certain proteins that actually protect you from bacteria or pathogens you might encounter in the normal course of living. So the microbiome seems to be very, very beneficial to you. You provide a nice little home for it, and it provides benefits to you. Now, the trouble here is in the last 60 years, in the era of antibiotics, another paradigm shift in medicine, is that for the first time, large numbers of these bacteria are being wiped out as a result of the widespread use of antibiotics. And in a well-meaning sense, that is to say, taking an antibiotic to treat a strep infection in your throat, well, it kills off that strep infection, but it kills off great numbers of bacteria within your colon, and that is why many people will notice changes in their bowel habits. But what occurred increasingly with the widespread use of antibiotics was the development of this infection called Clostridia difficile, or C. difficile. And it was postulated that maybe the bacterial population in your colon could be beneficial. For the first time in the 1950s, formal stool transplants were done on surgical floors and found that individuals with C. difficile infection could be treated successfully with a stool transplantation. Now, the surgeon who originally reported this, it was a case series of 8, he got some attention for it, but when this was looked at systematically, there was early reports of stool transplantation as early as the 2nd century AD in China. Then it was referred to as yellow tea, where you took a sample of stool from a normal individual and served it up slightly warm to an individual who had had intense diarrhea that was not improving, and it seemed to be extremely effective. Never widespread and never popular outside of the Chinese culture, but nonetheless, there was reports of it for many, many years ago. With the widespread spread of C. difficile infection, which we talked about on a previous show, the potential for recurrence, despite antibiotic use, the potential for recurrence of this, then there was more and more instances across the United States as well as the world of using a stool transplant as a way of treating and preventing recurrences of C. difficile. And it seems to be extraordinarily effective. In case reports now numbering more than 2,000 individuals, it seems to be 90-95% effective as far as preventing recurrence of this infection called Clostridia difficile. Now, increasingly, the notion of this as being effective was looked at in a number of different trials and randomized trials now, some principally out of Europe from last year, showing that this transplant could either be administered through enemas or during the course of a colonoscopy, or even as a study out of Europe last year, through a tube placed through the nose down into the gastrointestinal system, a nasogastric tube. But regardless of the way the transplant was administered, it seemed to be about 90% effective. Now, with the realization, that this was effective for C. difficile, then there was increasing enthusiasm across the United States for its use, but also the notion of the microbiome affecting other parts of their body began to be explored in this last 10 years. And this is really fascinating in terms of these studies. The principal studies were looking at metabolism, and the initial studies were in rodents, where they would take obese rodents, specifically bred to be obese, and then lean rodents, and taking the stool from the fat mice, if you will, and then feeding them to the thin mice, and then taking the stool from the thin mice and feeding them to the fat mice. And what we found is the fat mice got thinner and the thin mice got fatter. So it was a proof of concept that by changing the microbiome in the host, you could change the metabolism of the host. And so that study was looked at in a small number of healthy humans, where a similar experiment was done, and where the stool from thin individuals was transplanted into fat individuals, and their actual metabolism could be altered, and they actually lost weight. And similarly, it was not done in the converse because it was felt not to be ethically justified to be able to give thin individuals a condition that they did not already have. So that converse was not done in humans. But then the notion has increasingly been realized, well, there's other conditions. For example, we've talked about irritable bowel syndrome on previous shows, and the notion of antibiotics being used to treat that. The thought had been, well, perhaps there's a subtle alteration in bacteria in the irritable bowel syndrome, and now preliminary studies are showing that stool transplantation could be effective for that as well, as far as treating irritable bowel syndrome. Finally, last year, reported in the New England Journal, it was looked the microbiome in individuals with coronary artery disease, atherosclerotic disease, was looked at, and it found that those individuals, their microbiome produced a number of atherogenic metabolites that made the host more susceptible. And the thought had been that, well, perhaps the microbiome in individuals with coronary artery disease could be altered to potentially prevent individuals from developing atherosclerotic disease, and that potentially that could be done at a much, much earlier age. And someone in their, an individual in their teens and 20s, you could potentially alter their microbiome and potentially prevent atherosclerotic disease. So, as you can see, in a number of different areas, in terms of treatment of obesity, treatment of atherosclerotic disease, treatment of irritable bowel syndrome, but now in an area closer to my specialty, in terms of gastroenterology, inflammatory bowel disease. We've talked about that on a previous show, how it's a circumstance where you have a confluence of an alteration in the immune response to bacteria within the gastrointestinal system, and having an aberrant response where there's inflammation that's provoked by the immune system. The thought had been is that perhaps if we can, particularly since it's been known for years that antibiotics could potentially benefit individuals with inflammatory bowel disease, the notion was, well, if we reset that microbiome, give them a completely new one so it doesn't continue to stimulate the immune response, that might be beneficial, and preliminary studies show that seems to be effective too. It culminated in the report 2 years ago on the front page of the New York Times of an individual giving himself a stool transplant in his front bedroom and reporting that he was cured. Now that apparently was the final straw for the FDA, and the seeing individuals almost in their zeal in terms of embracing this as an alternative therapy, the FDA stepped in last year and issued a ruling saying that stool would now be regulated as a drug in the United States, and that it could not be studied except in the context of well-designed, controlled therapeutic trials. And so as a result, all research that had been going on at that time in terms of stool transplantation in all these areas came to a stop. And it created quite an upset in the gastroenterology community, because as we talked about before, C. difficile is so prevalent across the United States, and that 25,000 people a year are dying from it in terms of recurrent infections, that and seeing now stool transplant as being potentially effective for that group of individuals as far as preventing recurrence, the FDA relented and provided an exception for individuals who have a recurrent C. difficile infection or severe acute C. difficile infection, that stool transplantation could still be considered, but still had to be done in the context of a protocol, that is to say, procedure supervised by a physician, and individuals who receive the stool transplant had to understand that it is experimental and had to sign informed consent acknowledging that. So that's how things stood as of last year, and so now research is going forward a little bit more slowly and more with less frantic pace to the research, but now still proceeding forward in that context. Now, indeed, last year we initiated a stool transplantation program for individuals with C. difficile infection, and to this point, we've transplanted 2 individuals. They've responded well in terms of elimination of their tendency to have recurrent C. difficile infection, and so we've been excited about that. But right now, our stool transplantation program, which is through Naples Community Hospital, is just for individuals that have recurrent C. difficile infection and not for any other conditions. It's just that very, very specific condition.
We're going to take a short break and come back and talk more about stool and transplants and perhaps more of what it can do for us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
In just a few minutes.
When picking a realtor, don't just pick anyone. Pick someone with experience. Pick someone with a proven track record. Pick a realtor like Jim York from Downing Fry Realty, the #1 brokerage with the most real estate transactions in the area.
My husband and I had very specific ideas about what we wanted in our new home. Jim York was able to help us find the home that was ideal for us.
With over 20 years of real estate experience in Southwest Florida, Jim York has negotiated over $200 million in sales contracts. Selecting the right realtor is a critical decision that can earn you thousands when selling or save you thousands when buying.
Jim also helped us with a mortgage lender and a good real estate attorney. He went that extra mile, and his experience says it all.
Call Jim York for a no-obligation meeting at 239-273-6727 or visit his website, www.naplesyorkrealestate.com.
Welcome back to Dialogue with the Doctor. We are here this evening with Dr. Raymond Phillips, a practicing gastroenterologist in Naples, Florida. And we've been talking about a subject called stool transplantation, where you actually transplant stool from one individual to another. And you might ask, why would anybody do that? Well, we've been talking about that.
Yeah.
If you're in the hospital doing this, how long are you in for? What's the?
In the program that we're
Right.
doing at Naples Community Hospital in this transplant program, this is for individuals that have a recurrent C. difficile infection. That, I just want to clarify that. It's a very, very narrow indication. The individuals there, as an outpatient, they'll have a colonoscopy. The purpose of the colonoscopy is to make sure there's no other cause for their diarrhea, and then if no other cause is identified, and then during the course of that, the stool transplant is delivered. And then delivered into the colon itself through the colonoscope itself.
Mm-hmm.
And then afterwards, the person rests for an hour or so. We give them a product called Imodium that slows down gastrointestinal function so they don't evacuate that received transplant, and then they go home. Now, typically, in terms of side effects, some people will have a little bloating for a day or so. Some people will have, interestingly, constipation, which for many of them is a new experience, and instead of having diarrhea, will have constipation. But no substantial side effects have been reported to date, as far as with the thousands of people that have been undergone this. And as I said, we've had 2 recipients. Now, we talk fairly casually about a stool donation, but that process, the flip side, and we've talked about the recipient, the transplant, the reason for doing this, but the donor, that has to undergo tremendous efforts to screen the donor, because not just anybody off the street can be recruited for this, although in the early days, and that's what was occurring, but now with increasing realization that you can actually give infections to recipients, the stool donor has to be screened for any type of virus like HIV or hepatitis B, make sure there's no gastrointestinal infection, any parasite, and make sure there's nothing like Helicobacter pylori, because that can be spread through a fecal-oral route. So the actual donor has to be screened pretty intensively. And there's logistic issues involved in terms of providing a donation, because after all, the donation is a microbiome. It's a living biological sort of environment, as we've described, an ecosystem, if you will, and it has to be provided in a fairly urgent fashion to the recipient. That is to say, it has to be pretty fresh in order to be viable. It can't be just sitting around days and days. And then the other logistical issue that has come up, and is increasingly an issue, is that as time goes by, the stool donor has to be screened again. Because if a month or 2 goes by, you can't necessarily assume the stool donor hasn't picked up another infection or picked up an infection somewhere else.
Right.
So you have to end up doing repeated screening of the donor, which can become quite expensive. Now, as you might anticipate, the stool donor is typically a very healthy person. So insurance is not going to be paying for all these hundreds and hundreds of dollars worth of tests for the donor to have and so that's a little bit of a logistical issue in terms of covering the cost of screening for the donor and so forth. But we're able to achieve those costs through the cooperation of the hospital. We're able to meet those costs, and so as I said, we're able to have had 2 successful circumstances to date. And I want to hasten to add, we're not the only place doing this. There's 7 other hospitals across Florida that are doing this, and a number of different institutions across the United States. But nonetheless, it's exciting for us. But as you can see, the logistical issues have become such that there's now MIT is exploring the issue of possibly having stool banks. That is to say, donations of stools that are freeze-dried and stored and then can be sort of thawed out when convenient or when needed to be used. That way, we don't run into the continued costs in terms of rescreening donors. Out of the West Coast, there's been exploration of using acrylic capsules that could be dissolved and placing a stool transplant within these acrylic capsules that are designed to dissolve when they arrive in the colon itself. And that's an exciting advance in terms of delivery of the stool transplant. Because there is some issues in terms of colonoscopy. Most everybody may not be terribly enthusiastic about having another colonoscopy if they've had those before. And individuals who have other conditions may not, other than C. difficile in the future, may want to have some other way of having that stool transplant delivered. So other delivery methods are being explored at this point, and that's one of the most exciting ones in terms of delivery of a stool transplant through dissolving capsules.
I have a question.
Please.
If you initially said, this question goes to the etiology or causation of some of the diseases that you mentioned. You said early on in life, in infancy, when you're born, basically you're contaminated by your mother's or father's, stool, and that is the microbiome that you have taken on. So have you then taken on some of their genetic diseases as well? I mean, how is it that if for example, you say, my mother's obese, I'm obese, is it because you've inherited their microbiome? Or the same with coronary artery disease? I mean, is it some of it from there rather than?
Well, that's one of the lines of research right now, is that exactly what you're saying is it may not be a genetic in the sense of you inheriting genes from your parents making you susceptible to heart disease or making you susceptible to obesity. It may be the actual bacterial population, the microbiome of your parents may be priming you to be susceptible to these conditions, to be susceptible to being obese or susceptible to being having atherosclerotic disease.
And then the next question I was just going forward is, because we've had Dr. Teresa Sievers on this show, and
right.
She's anti-aging integrative medicine. She talks a lot about the gut because it's the key to many diseases in her view. So therefore, if you were to get a stool transplant from a thin person to treat obesity in a fat person, overweight person, can that overweight person then ruin that transplant by eating certain foods and then gain the weight back over time? I mean, in other words, has their environment caused the microbiome to change to where they're obese to begin with, environment meaning what they're eating?
Well, and just to echo what you're saying, the answer is probably yes, because what's been looking at in this past year is that individuals that follow particular diets can actually subtly change the microbiome in the system. And so, for example, if a heavy person continues to eat high-fat items, it may well encourage that component of the microbiome that metabolically is supportive of that would continue. So, but that hasn't really been we don't have enough
We don't
really
know.
research to say, but at the very least, in the experiments that have been reported to date, when an individual has metabolic syndrome, who's heavy, and has received a microbiome, a fecal transplant from a thin person, when they've remained on the same diet, they have lost weight without any change in their diet or change in their nature of their diet. Now you're talking about the next variable. Well, gee, what if they just go back to eating the way they did? Could they overwhelm the effect of that transplant? And probably you can overwhelm any effect, because obesity, there's many different components to it in terms of psychological component and behavioral issues that can contribute to it. But at least in the sense of changing that one variable, you can indeed make a difference in terms of someone's metabolism and cause them to lose weight.
A related question, you mentioned colitis, ulcerative colitis, inflammatory bowel disease, being related to the bacterial microbiome in the gut and inflammatory alteration that occurs. Have there been studies done to alter the microbiome in the gut with food or other material so that colitis gets better?
Yes, there have been a number of different studies looking at that, and particularly using a number of anti-inflammatory diets, in terms of omega-3 fatty acids, and those have shown to have an anti-inflammatory effect in the GI tract itself. And in mild to moderate ulcerative colitis, it seems to have a beneficial effect, and was felt because in the studies it seemed to influence the production of prostaglandins that are less inflammatory, et cetera. But it may have been through another mechanism, that is to say, an alteration in the microbiome. And so it's plausible that that changes in the diet can actually lead to an anti-inflammatory effect, but also, at least in inflammatory bowel disease or ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, the thought has been that there's a less stimulation of the immune system or an alteration of that stimulation, so you don't have such a vigorous immune reaction.
Well, I can see why Dr. Phillips said that this is a once-in-a-career change in medicine, because this really can open many doors, it seems.
Well, and for these different conditions that affect so many people, and to use, it's really exciting for us.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks.